And finally, to tee up today's interview with our amazing guest, Lawrence Jordan, I want to give you a little bit of history on him just to put things in perspective. I was so excited to have Lawrence on the show because he has such a storied career as a film editor and as a working professional in this industry. It all started back in the mid 80s when he was assisting on films like Back to the Future and Terms of Endearment, which are, of course, two of the most iconic films probably of all time, and I'm certainly a huge fan of both. And then, of course, he later got into narrative film editing. Just visit his IMDb page, which I will link in the show notes, to see the unbelievable body of work that he has amassed over the years. But just some highlights include the film Deuce Bigalow, Riding in Cars with Boys, and 50 Shades of Black on the feature level. And he's also edited television like CSI Miami, doing a number of episodes on that show, and countless other incredible projects. Naturally, I was super happy to be able to pick Lawrence's brain and try to cover a lot of ground, as I always do, on the business of editing, on the craft, and all the countless lessons that Lawrence has picked up and generously shared with us from his many years as a working editor in Hollywood. So, without further ado, I am going to turn this over to my interview with Lawrence Jordan. All right. So, Lawrence Jordan, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Noam. Glad to be here.
So there's a lot of ground I want to cover with you. I've certainly been a fan of your work for a long time, long before we even scheduled this interview. I've seen a lot of your movies, some of which I will have highlighted in the intro to this episode. And I have to ask you, just to start, like many of my guests, what was your origin story? How did you break into the business? When did you know you wanted to get into filmmaking? And if you could paint a bit of a picture for us about those early years in your career, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, sure. I come from somewhat of a traditional path. I was kind of born into the business. My grandfather was a projectionist in the Nickelodeon days in Times Square when he was a kid, and he went on to become a projection and sound engineer for 60 Minutes, CBS for 20 years or something like that. And then, my dad kind of was interested in the business and in motion pictures since he was a kid, and my grandfather was able to kind of help him find a job at RKO Studios in New York, and my father went on to build this big commercial company. It was one of the first like integrated post-production companies in New York City in the 60s, called Cinemetric. And a lot of big time editors came through his shop, a lot of really kind of people who cut some of the more important films of the late 60s and 70s and on. And he worked across the hall from this woman named Dee Dee Allen, who you might know of. Dee Dee was a legendary editor who cut Bonnie and Clyde and, Dog Day Afternoon, a lot of films for Sidney Lumet and Arthur Penn. And, through his relationships and my interest in film, when I was a kid, I grew up on movies. I'm not a particularly I grew up on movies. I'm not a particularly studious person. I just like watching films and television.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of an audio visual learner, and really liked English and things like English literature. And things like that, as opposed to, math and science. And, I gravitated towards the arts. I mean, it was what I was around. And, pretty early on, I had an interest in acting. I did some acting school when we moved out to LA. And I was very interested in photography as a kid. I was shooting pictures from the time I was like 10 years old on my dad's camera that I kind of absconded with. And I just sort of, the film business just seemed like a natural fit. and I got a job as a runner, as a schlepper. I was answering phones at a film editing supply company. That was my first job when I was like 19.
Wow.
And then I got a job at a camera rental house, and I was driving their delivery truck. So even though I had an in the business, I still had to pay my dues, and I schlepped for, so to speak, for about 2 or 3 years, because I was also young. I got into the union finally when I was 19, and I went to work for my dad's trailer company at the time. I found the road to getting into the cinematographers union to be really tough, and I had, my mother would say, ants in my pants. I kind of couldn't sit still, and I just wanted to start making movies.
And did
So
you
I
know
got.
at that time, sorry to interject, but did you know that editing was ultimately where you would land, or were you still, it sounds like you were still dabbling in a bunch of different areas, cinematography, right? You were kind of exploring these different paths, or was editing always kind of your true north as far as where you were ideally trying to go with your career?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. I mean, what was happening was I was working at this camera rental company, and I was doing everything from delivering cameras to fixing, like, ballasts and 10Ks, and then sort of got a little bit of taste of working with. We were renting out a lot of Aeroflex 35 millimeter cameras to Warner Brothers Television, and I got to work on a couple of shoots, and non-union stuff, and they were pretty brutal. They were like 15, 18-hour days, and I was having trouble like making any contacts with the union. I kind of couldn't get any traction there, and so editing started seeming like something that was going to be more appealing because all the people that like I kind of grew up around, but I wanted to do the cinematography thing, but the editing thing seemed like something where it was just going to be a little bit easier to kind of get involved in, because it was so hard to get into any of the crafts at that time, even with contacts. You know what I mean? Because we were
Hmm.
from New York, and even the Hollywood community was kind of like a closed network, an old boys network, in the truest sense of the word. Um, so, I started thinking about it, and I was living on the Speedway in Venice Beach, and was going to see a lot of movies at the Nuart and those kinds of places. And I went out to see Apocalypse Now at the Cinerama Dome with my friends when I was 19.
Nice.
And as it turns out, my uncle was the supervising editor on that.
Oh, cool.
Actually, yeah, not Walter Murch, but Richard Marks.
Amazing.
And yeah, he had cut Godfather too, so that was kind of firing up my jets about editing and the kind of films he was making and working with Francis and things like that. So I saw that in 235 anamorphic, and at the Dome at a midnight show with like four of my friends, and I was just like, I came out of there and I was like, that's it. I mean, that's what I want to do. I want
Wow.
to make those kinds of things.
Yeah, there's
And
always that one movie I find when I talk to so many filmmakers just on and off this podcast, and everybody has that moment that you can always pinpoint. So that I love that you brought that up, and I'm curious as to whether or not the actual in a sense, lifestyle of being an editor had played into your decision at all? Because I know for a lot of filmmakers that I speak to, looking back 10, 20, 30 years into their career, oftentimes there are these different aspects that they're really interested in, whether it's, cinematography and editing, let's say, but they require, although they're both creative in nature and they're both part of the storytelling process, they require really a different lifestyle. Like when you're editing, you're at a desk, you may have very long days, and it can be very grueling, I'm sure, but you're still somewhat on your own, you're running your own show to an extent, I'm sure, whereas being on a production when you're have to be physically present every day on a film set, it takes kind of a different type of it's just a different type of work, even though it's on such a similar, using a similar part of your brain in a sense, I think. So
Yeah,
did that play into it at all for you, as far as enjoying the ability to work kind of in your own space and everything as an editor?
yeah, no, that's a great question, and I think it's an important question for people who are just starting out to consider. And I come from a fairly like traditional family background. My father chose not to do feature films because of the hours that it entailed and the kind of the freelance lifestyle and things like that. And in terms of cinematography, that was a big consideration for me also. I was meeting some cinematographers, and I was seeing that they were basically on the road for 6, 8, 10 months out of the year. um, and I just started to feel like that wasn't going to fit my kind of vision of what I had for my own kind of path. Um, so that, yeah, that definitely had a bearing on my decision. I just didn't want to be traveling all the time. Having said that, the editing, path is different, but it has a lot of similarities to all the crafts in the business, which is that it is not a traditional 9 to 5 job in any sense of the word. When you're, one of the keys on a film, whether it be a director or a cinematographer, production designer, an editor, you're going to work long hours and intense hours for short bursts of time. And when I say short, it could be anywhere from 3 months to a year or longer on a project. And you kind of become married to that project to a certain extent. I mean, you work usually, 10, 12-hour days or longer. The people who are making the film, usually the directors you're working for, are, have to be really passionate about what they're trying to accomplish, because not that many people get a chance to do what we do. You know what I'm saying? So when they do get that shot, you know, they are 100% committed to it in almost every situation that I've been in my career. And they expect you as the editor to be just as committed, and you have to be. And if you're not, you should really kind of maybe take a second glance about what you're going to do with your life, because like I did with cinematography, I could handle the long hours and the hard work. In fact, I love it because as an editor, you get into the zone and you get into your creative place, and it's a gift, man. I mean, that I've gotten to do this for so long.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um,
And do you hit though a place ever where, even though I'm sure you value so much these amazing projects that you're working on, and you get so much out of them creatively, and you get to add so much to them with your own voice and your own talent, but I mean, when you're on any project for that long, do you ever hit that lull where maybe it's not necessarily specific to the project, but where you just feel, you've seen it so many times, and you just, you have to step away or you have to distance yourself? Do you get to that point? I know a lot of editors talk about that. I've experienced it with my own projects, but is that something that you go through? And if so, is there any way that you deal with that or try to circumvent it somehow?
yeah, I mean, you know, uh, the older I've got, the more I've been able to kind of like manage manage that. I mean, when I was younger, every day was incredibly exciting from beginning to end. And especially in the early days when I was an assistant, you're kind of not having to watch the film so much, but you're working with these really talented people. So that was pretty easy. When I started cutting, um, I was, just again, I'm a movie kind of fanatic, and I love the process. So I really didn't get burnt out, and I could kind of like take it home with me and continue to think about it and come up with ideas during my dream states and things like that.
Hmm.
And you know, as I've gotten older though, and I got to tell you, with the advent of digital technology, it's a little bit more intense. And I don't know, maybe I'm getting tired in you know, in my the later part of my career here, but you know, you create so many versions of scenes, and you know, you see the film, you look at it so many times. I mean, think about this now. Like when we were on 35, we would make a set of changes, and then, you know, we would look at it in theater, or play it on the chem, or something, and it was a much sort of like slower process. But now, you know, sometimes you can make an entire set of changes and you don't even look at the film again, and then you go back, you go through it and make another set of changes, so you haven't even had a chance to kind of get a perspective on what you've just done. You're almost
Hmm.
working it in individual scenes more than you are as a whole story. So, you know, I think that's kind of become a little bit more difficult. I On this film that I just finished, I've been on it 10.5 months, and I got to tell you, I didn't kind of like come to the end of my road on it, you know, just mentally, until the portion we just finished, which was the sound mix,
Hmm.
and kind of like, but again, you know, you you sort of like compartmentalize it in a way. You're not, you know, looking at picture changes anymore. You're focusing on sound, and what the mixers are doing, and the director's ideas at that point, and what kind of contributions you can make at that point. So, you know, I would say that it's a little bit, I'm a little bit tired on this one, but, you know, again, I feel really lucky to have even been able to do this as a career. So, you develop a muscle. You know what I'm saying? You
Yep.
kind of like learn to try to stay objective. It's exciting when other people come in and present their ideas. You know, whether it's producers, or obviously when the director starts on his or her cut. And it's always interesting, man. Never, never a dull moment.
That's amazing. I think it's a great sign that you know, you're doing exactly what you should be doing. I think, you know, we all have our ups and downs with everything, but to have done that many movies and be at this point in your career, and still have that sort of energy and stamina and love for what you're doing, I admire that. I certainly hope that, you know, I continue to have that myself, and that's very inspiring. I'm curious to go back. I kind of sort of skipped ahead a little bit, or skipped over a couple of things I wanted to get to, you know, back from your earlier days when you were first starting out. But I couldn't help but notice on IMDb some of your earliest credits, and I'm sure there were a bunch of other things maybe before this that just aren't listed, but some of the earliest IMDb credits are some amazing movies, Terms of Endearment, Back to the Future, notably, which, by the way, I just watched again like 2 weeks ago, the original. I mean, we sort of talked about how you got into the business a little bit, but I'm curious to know what that was like on those early films, and maybe just because it's so fresh for me, if we could get into Back to the Future, was that something that you were actually working on the sound level on that, correct?
Yeah, I was
Sound
working
editing.
for Yeah, I was working for a gentleman named Charles Campbell, who did a lot of Steven Spielberg's earlier movies. He won the Academy Award for E.T., and he was really one of the preeminent sound editors of his day. And I had worked on Terms of Endearment, and then Buckaroo Banzai, as an apprentice and an assistant editor. And I was 23 years old. I had been working in the business for 4 years, pretty intensely, and I had never, you know, finished college, and I decided, you know what, I got to kind of, you know, change it up a little bit, and I went traveling in Europe for 5 months, and when I got back, I was absolutely, you know, had a great time. It was an amazing experience, and I highly recommend it. But when I got back, I was really chomping at the bit to get back to work. And I just started, you know, I just picked up the phone and started calling everybody I know. And there was this opportunity as an assistant sound editor at a company called Real Sound. And that was Chuck's company. and I did a bunch of movies there. I mean, I did an early Michael Keaton film called Touch and Go, and I did Three Amigos with Chevy Chase and Martin Short and Steve Martin, and we just did they kind of like put a lot of films through that company, and so I was working on a bunch of stuff at the same time. But then, and of course, I knew that Chuck had worked with Steven and had done E.T. And then Chuck took me aside one day and said, "We're going to do this film for Steven's company, and Bob Zemeckis is directing it. It's called Back to the Future. Would you be my primary assistant on this?" And I was just like, "Hell yeah, of course."
So were you
So
involved at all, or were you did you have any access to the actual production, or were you seeing things once the cut was locked? At what stage were you actually getting to put your touch on it?
Well, if you know a little bit about the history of Back to the Future, it was initially shot with Eric Stoltz in the role of Marty McFly, and they, at a certain point in time, decided that that wasn't working, and they reshot it with Michael J. Fox.
Oh, I never knew that. That's
Yeah,
fascinating. Had they shot the whole movie, or they just
yeah,
got?
they shot.
Oh
I
my
don't know if
God.
they shot the entire movie, but they shot most of it. And yeah, Wikipedia. It's a pretty legendary story because they were so far into production, and I guess they just decided that it wasn't working out to their liking, and they recast the McFly role with Michael J. Fox, and we were not involved at that point at all. We were put on the film when they were when they had a pretty solid cut, and that's kind of pretty much the standard operating procedure for when sound crews come on, and we got invited to Amblin over at Universal, the Amblin offices at Universal, and to Mr. Spielberg's screening room, and the entire sound crew, which was like, I don't know, they were bigger back then. It was probably like 6 or 8 people at that point, got to watch the film in black and white without any of the visual effects, or maybe very few of the visual effects completed. And what can I say? I mean, just imagine seeing Back to the Future in black and white in Spielberg's screening room. It
Wow.
was mind blowing. Yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
did
it was
you
pretty earth
know when
shattering.
you saw it? I mean, people often talk about later on when they work on these iconic projects that I didn't really know that, I had no idea it was going to be what it was. But that was such a, looking back at it now, I mean, it was such a revolutionary film, and it still has such an impact to this day, I think. And I mean, did you get that sense from it? I mean, I'm sure you were excited just to be there, period. But was there any sort of like quality to it that you felt like this is a little bit different, this one, or maybe this is gonna have a longer ride somehow in the future?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I got to tell you, like everyone else who's seen and loved the film, you know, in that rough form screening, uh, even though it was far from finished, it was pretty mind blowing.
Hmm.
And I think we all, when the lights came up and Spielberg walked into the room and asked how we liked it, we were all pretty pumped, and I think we knew that this was going to be a huge hit. It was before the big superhero Marvel movies and things like that, so obviously, the Close Encounters and the ETs had been out, and we just had a feeling like this was going to be a really big movie. But just to check myself, I don't think that any of us imagined how big it would be,
Yeah.
or how sort of legendary it would become. But we knew it was a great movie. We all agreed on that, and we kind of just had a feeling. And going into starting a job like that is a pretty exciting exciting thing.
Yeah, and especially being involved in the sound as well, because that film is so dynamic in so many ways, and the sound is incredible. And again, that's something I was really admiring watching it back. In particular, the scene where Marty McFly is playing Johnny Be Good, and there's just so much going on in that scene with the
Yeah.
music and the crowd, and the, forget his name, like Chuck Berry's cousin on the phone, and there's all these like elements happening, and it's like now it's, whatever it is, almost 35 years old, but it still sounds so good. So I mean, were you in the how deep into the actual editing process were you able to get? Because understandably, that was one of your earlier credits. But were you able to do a lot of hands-on work on the actual, the nuts and bolts of actually editing the sound on that film?
No, I actually, as an assistant editor, that's kind of not your gig.
Mm-hmm.
You're there to serve the needs of the editing crew and the supervising sound editor. So no, I wouldn't say that there was a lot of creative work, hands-on, at all in for my role. However, what was exciting was to see how these craftspeople approached it, and how they put all those pieces together, and really getting a direct hands-on view of how they created this thing and what was involved. And we talked about the hours before. They had a hard release date on that, and I remember that we had, I think it was like 2 mixing stages working 12 hours a day, AM and PM. They were mixing that film like 24 hours a day at one point. So, it was just this incredible immersion into the process, and assisting a guy like Chuck Campbell, who was just, truly a master. I mean, he won the Academy Award for that movie. He shared it with a guy named Bob Rutledge. And yeah, I mean, it was amazing. And it's pretty gratifying to hear you say that, after 35 years, it still stands up. They did some really amazing things in it, and created this phantasmagorical world that that really resonated with the audience. So no, didn't get to do any really purely creative work in that sense, but being part of the process, even as an assistant, is a pretty kind of creative task in itself.
Sure.
And
And in a
you
sense,
know
I would imagine you get to have this vantage point that you maybe don't get to have when you are literally sitting there pushing the buttons, and you get to be a little bit, take a step back maybe and observe all that's going on, and maybe, get to take in. I'm not sure if you realized it at the time, or maybe it's something that hit you later, but I can only imagine, whether it's on that film or Terms of Endearment, any of these other early projects, there must have just been a sponge, just absorbing just so much
oh,
input, right?
yeah, and sometimes I don't think that people who are starting out, who see that there's kind of a traditional path that most people are required to take. Not everyone, but sort of like most people take the traditional path as starting out as an apprentice, and then they work their way up to an assistant, and then an editor. And I mean, that's the guild model, and it was established for a reason. You get trained in the workflow, you get trained in the process from start to finish, and when you do become an editor, you have that body of knowledge that you can, refer to, and you've become an expert at, to a certain extent, to know how things get done. I mean, do you know what I'm saying? It's like you need to know how everything's going to work downstream, so you can accomplish your job and make sure that everything gets done correctly. Because when you do get to the supervising editor roles and things like that, you're responsible. You're a key in your, you're the key player in your department. So, you've got to answer to people if things are, go south or something like that.
Yep,
So, yeah, no,
absolutely.
it's a great vantage point. Terms of Endearment was was mind-boggling in the sense that, we also knew it was going to be a great film.
And on that one,
Uh,
you were not working on the sound side. You were an apprentice editor, correct?
yeah, picture
Okay.
editor. Yeah, absolutely. Got to go to Houston on location. I mean, think about it. I was a kid for all intents and purposes, and on location with Jack Nicholson and Shirley MacLaine and Deborah Winger, and those were the days when you used to look at the dailies in a screening room. We had a makeshift screening room in this hotel that we were set up in Houston, and every night after they would finish shooting, we'd watch all the dailies, and the whole crew would be like, like, I don't know, not the whole crew, but maybe 30 or 40 people would get together and watch the material, and it was pretty exciting stuff. And then just putting it together and working, with Jim Brooks, the kind of talent that he has, and then having the picture be released and just having it be a box office smash, getting nominated for 5 Academy Awards, including my boss, who was nominated for editing. So yeah, that was a great ride. That was
How
that was
common was it back then for somebody, even out on an apprentice level, to be able to have that sort of opportunity? Because now, as I'm sure you're well aware, there's a big push for a lot of everything's sort of DIY, a lot of independent filmmakers, a lot of younger filmmakers. And I very much came up through that camp as well, because I grew up in Toronto where there was, a decent film industry, but nothing like here. And really my
right.
only path that I could see was just, make stuff myself. And, for better or for worse, that's sort of what I had chosen. There are a lot of filmmakers, I think now, especially now, that are maybe, 10, 15 years younger than I am, and they're shooting stuff on their iPhones, and they're not getting that apprenticeship that you described. They're not, having that traditional path of breaking in through, an assistant role and working their way up and so forth. But I wonder, is that path still accessible to somebody? Do you think if you were, let's say 19, 20 years old today, do you think you would still be able to take a similar path? Was it, or do you think based on how the industry has changed now that you might pursue a different path? I know it's impossible to say, but if you had to speculate, just because there's so many young filmmakers listening to this, probably thinking, they're at a crossroads, and do they pursue making their own stuff and just trying to get it out there, or do they try to get on some big production? Do you think that's still, in 2019, is that still a viable option for a younger
Well,
filmmaker?
well, yes, it is, and I mean, what we have to define is, two different scenarios, because um, even young filmmakers who are maybe making films for YouTube, or or the independent film circuit, um, they're going to need a way to finance those films and finance that work. I mean, obviously you can make short YouTube videos for relatively cheap, but you still got to eat. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
You still got to pay your rent and things like that. So, there's that route. And then there is sort of like what is really a completely, unique world, which is, higher end feature films and television production. And it's not just here in Los Angeles, it's worldwide now, obviously. New York, Sydney, Vancouver, Toronto, everywhere has some sort of film production center. I just got back from Italy. There's a lot of editors in Rome, and again, the volume, of course, is much different than Los Angeles, but still, there's this sort of higher end where you work your way up and you can, make a living. You're not necessarily the filmmaker, but you're working as part of a team, and you're creating sort of larger scale projects. So really what it comes down to is economics. I mean, like so much else in this life, it's like, do you have the ability to sort of finance yourself as you try to build a filmmaking career. I mean, it's the quintessential starving artist scenario, isn't it?
Hmm.
It's like, because that's what we are, right? I mean, we're craftspeople and we're artists, and can you afford to, or do you have a benefactor who can support your work? So that's the question I think young filmmakers have to ask themselves. Now, having said that, if I was exposed to the technology available today when I was 19 years old, would I go out and try to make my own films and starve for a while until I could see if I got any traction? Absolutely.
Hmm.
I mean, there's no question in my mind. You know, with the tools that are available today, and the the, the self distribution methods and things like that. I mean, I definitely would have put in some time trying to make some sort of endeavor into having more of a personal voice put out there. Again, I loved cinematography, but I mean, I couldn't rent a Panavision camera. I couldn't even rent an Aeroflex camera. I mean, it was a fortune. Processing on a film was a fortune. Believe me, I budgeted several small films when I was younger, and it was just cost prohibitive. You had to raise the money. So,
Wow. As
and I
you
don't think you
and
need to do that today.
No, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think it's a
No.
great point. It doesn't necessarily need to be an either or scenario. It can be both. You can
Yeah.
potentially work your way up while you're making your own stuff on the evenings and weekends, and still supporting yourself and learning from the studio side or from the traditional side, and maybe applying that to your independent work. And yeah, I think that's a really good way to look at it, because you don't have to necessarily box yourself in, especially that early on. I do have to ask you about Deuce Bigelow. I know I'm skipping way ahead,
Go ahead.
but
Yeah. No. It's
I just asked you because when that came out, I was in high school, and that was a huge favorite film of many of my friends, myself included. We probably had that on repeat for several months in the basement. So just for my own gratification, I have to ask you about that a little bit. And any I guess just to frame it in more of a broad sense, that seems like such a fun movie to work on. And I don't know if it was, because you never know when you see the final product what the actual process was like, but it just it just like exuded so much positive energy and humor, and it was it just still, like, as I talk about it now, it brings a smile to my face. So was it what was the process like working on that kind of movie? And are movies that you work on that ultimately feel that way, do they feel that way when you're working on them, if that makes any sense as a question? But do you actually find that the end result has some sort of, or the process itself and how you feel during the process has any sort of bearing on the end result and how it's perceived?
I think so. I mean, yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you're having fun on a film and it's a, and it's a, you have an instinct that it's a pretty good film and people are going to like it. That definitely sort of like gets imparted into your work. If that's the correct way to
Yeah.
phrase it. What happened on Deuce Bigelow was, it was kind of like the point in my career where I kind of like took a turn into comedy. Now, I've always been known amongst my friends and peers as kind of a funny guy, and I like to believe I have a pretty good sense of humor. It's kind of gotten darker over the years, but so be it. But I've always loved comedy, and but I started out cutting on sort of much more dramatic stuff. I got my break as like my biggest break as an editor on the pilot for NYPD Blue, which was this pretty gritty, television
Yeah,
drama,
of
right?
course. Oh, you did the
And
pilot. I didn't realize you had done the pilot. Oh, interesting.
yeah,
And a bunch of other
yeah,
episodes too.
I did the pilot in the first season. I got nominated for an Emmy. So again, I was pretty young, and I had gotten involved with people at Botchko Productions and the director Greg Hoblet, because I was one of the first guys to really embrace digital editing on the Avid. I saw it when I was young, and it kind of like a light bulb, more like maybe a small nuclear explosion went off in my head. And I said, this is it, game over. This is how films are going to be made in the future. I mean, in all due modesty, I mean, I just got it. I mean, I grew up in an editing room from the time I was a small child, like a baby. My dad used to put me in the film trim bins, and I saw videotape, and I knew that wasn't it. And they were struggling to make that work. And then I saw the Avid, and I just said, wow, I got to learn this. So I completely immersed myself in it. And I became like one of the first really, sort of like experts at it. And I got hired at Botchko because of that, partially because of that. And, or maybe entirely because of that. I'm not sure. Anyhow, I was completely, like in my wheelhouse, man. I was like, most of the other editors were really resisting it. They were a bit older, and they were kind of resisting making the transition from 35. In fact, I think a couple of editors quit. The assistants were having trouble, and I went in and I hired this kid I met out of UT, who just like looked at the Avid and said he had worked on a Mac Classic in college. And I said, can you learn this, man? And he said, yeah, I got it.
Wow.
And he became a wizard at it, like in 2 weeks. So, I got that job, and I was doing these kind of awesome, projects like NYPD Blue. And then Greg Hoblet asked me to cut this movie with Denzel Washington and John Goodman called Fallen. And, so I was sort of like along that path. I did a film for Kiefer Sutherland, was kind of like an action drama. And I forget how I kind of transitioned, but I got asked to come on as an additional or second editor on Deuce Bigalow. And, because again, I think that the editor that was cutting it was great. And actually he's a pretty legendary editor himself. But, these guys, Sandler's crew at the time, they were young guys, and they kind of, they wanted to move fast and things like that. So I came in there, and I tried to, meet their needs as best as possible. And I think I did a pretty good job. And, it was a really fun experience. I was working with guys who were pretty close in age, and pretty close in sort of like our demented mindset of comedy. And,
was it a long process total? Because I noticed that you have several other credits right in and around 98, 99 ish. So did it go relatively quickly as a result of being able to work on Avid, or just because of the guys you were working with and the pace that they were working at? Did that help with speed at all? Sorry, go ahead.
I think it was just about meeting a schedule, like pretty much every film you work for the studio's on. They don't want it to go on forever. And, being kind of like the sort of beginnings of my working with improv comedy, we just had to get it into a place where the studio was happy. It was Disney, or I forget. It was like I think it was some kind of like Hollywood Pictures or something like that. But yeah, no, it was a good experience. Adam was involved a lot. His partner at the time, Jack Giarputa, was involved like heavily. Rob Schneider was involved because he was obviously starring in it. And, it was just this sort of like insane cauldron of ideas and hijinks that was not only in the film, but in the cutting room. And it was really fun. I mean, those guys were really funny. They kept me laughing, and we worked really hard on it. And I do think it was kind of a shorter schedule in that respect. But yeah, I kind of felt that it was a pretty funny movie. I didn't think it was going to be as sort of well received as it was. I didn't know. I think there became a time that it becomes harder, like Back to the Future, Terms of
Yeah.
Endearment, things you kind of like know are going to have a broad commercial appeal.
For sure, but
Uh,
I really think that it paved the way, and I'm with you. I'm someone that, as much as I love comedy and respect comedy, I'm more of a dramatic. Like, just as a fan, I watch a lot of dramas. I watch a lot of, old Hollywood movies and French New Wave, and
yeah,
I like, So I'm not
yeah,
necessarily the demographic that probably, the maybe the
right.
studio was going after, but I loved it, and I feel like it opened the door for so many. Even a lot of the type of comedy that we see now with Seth Rogen or whoever else that's sort of popular at the moment. I think it
Yeah,
really, in my opinion, that movie really sort of paved the way. Just the type of humor and just the style of it, and there's so many elements to it now that, looking back, it probably maybe didn't, like you said, didn't feel exactly the same as some of the other films, but in retrospect, it's pretty amazing what that movie, I think, did for comedy. I actually think, so many friends of mine, anyone that grew up in that era, is, they just think so fondly of that film. It's amazing.
well, well, I think you bring up a good point. I think it was kind of like the beginning of a generational shift. I mean, it wasn't the Belushi, Aykroyd, Chevy Chase brand of Saturday Night Live anymore. It was the Adam Sandler kind of brand, and
Hmm.
films are really, and audiences are so defined by generations. I mean, uh, the Star Wars generation, and then there's the Lord of the Rings generation, and it's like these new audience members who are coming into the theaters, or watching on streaming now. Obviously, it's like what they're going to be receptive to is going to be different than what someone 10 years older or 20 years older is going to be receptive to. They grew up in a different world. I mean, I have an 11-year-old son, and he's growing up in an entire world. I mean, we can't fathom the world that he's growing up in. And
Hmm.
I saw that picture last year, called, I think it was called Eighth Grade.
Oh yeah, I
uh,
saw it. Yeah, great film.
and yeah, it was a great film, and it really made someone, like my age, see the kind of challenges that these kids are growing up with now. So I do think it was a generational shift. I do think that it ushered in sort of like that, like the Pineapple Expresses, and those kinds of,
Hmm.
sort of zanier, sort of even more off the wall comedies in a more contemporary sense. Um,
Absolutely.
and it really got me some chops for doing what I've done on my last three films, which is cut incredibly crazy improvisational comedy that you have 5 and 6 choices for jokes for every joke in the script. So
Yeah, that's
that's a whole different
amazing.
kind of edit.
Well, then
Yeah.
I mean, it falls so heavily on you as the editor, and I'm curious to kind of unpack that process for with you, because I think it applies not only to comedy but also in some cases to drama, where certain directors like to improvise very heavily, and maybe there are two, three takes that are pretty much exactly as they were written on the script, and then maybe several that are improvised. And as the editor, do you typically, in those scenarios, and we can stick to comedy for now, but do you sit with your director and pull takes with them and audition things for them, or do you essentially go in yourself for the first few, first couple passes, and make all of those decisions yourself? Because that seems like you could completely, I mean, obviously, as the editor, you can completely shape so much of the final product. It's all in your hands, but even more so when you have that much range to work with from the actors. So yeah, what does that look like in terms of your relationship with the director, and how those decisions are made in the editing room?
Well, it's a lot of fun, and it is truly the sort of most creative I've been able to be on a film. Uh, there's that famous film with Warren Beatty and Dustin Hoffman. I don't know if you remember, but it was called Ishtar, and
Hmm.
it was directed by Elaine May. And I remember hearing stories about that film. It was kind of like, after I started, so it's way back there. But I remember hearing stories on that film that they would improvise for 10 whole minutes, and that was like, that was the size of 1,000-foot mag roll on 35 millimeter film, right?
Yep.
So, and it was just like, oh my God, it was overwhelming. They would just have these reels and reels of these 10-minute improvs. And obviously that film was kind of an infamous disaster. But having said that, with digital, you're limited by the size of your memory card. So like on my last three films, with Marlon Wayans, you know, I often had takes that would fill up an entire memory card, like 33 minutes. So it's just this huge volume of material that you have to go through, and you have to, sort of like, figure out which way is up, and it can be quite overwhelming. I mean, we had almost 200 hours of dailies
Oh,
on this
wow.
film just finished. Yeah, think about it. I mean,
So are
200
you
hours,
having to work in a
90-minute
sense
film.
off of instinct because you're at the same time you have all this material, but you're probably on a similar deadline to, or maybe even shorter to what you probably had when you had far less material. So do you, and I'm making that assumption, but do you in a sense have to rely very heavily on instinct, and just when something hits a nerve or it gets a laugh, okay, we're flagging that, or do you have to be pretty ruthless early on in terms of what gets left, on the floor, so to speak, or is that not necessarily what the process looks like for you?
No, I mean, that's roughly the idea, but I'd say it's sort of like, it's both. Because you're getting so material, and they're on stage, and the director really isn't. This is my third film with Mike Titus, who is the director of this film, and we've developed sort of like a really nice relationship. I think he's a really talented guy, and he likes my work, and we've kind of developed this shorthand, so that already makes it easier. But having said that, they're too busy shooting the movie and creating all of this material to come in the cutting room during the editor's cut, or during the
Hmm.
first pass, whatever you want to call it. So Mike trusts me, and basically what I'm sort of using as my jumping point, in my starting point, is the script, obviously. But then you get all of these improvs, and Marlon really just kind of uses the script as a jumping off point. And then he can go in so many different directions. So what you'll end up doing is you'll end up maybe cutting like 3, 4, sometimes 5 versions of a scene, or even a joke. And yes, it's very instinctual. It's, what do I find the funniest? What do I think is maybe a combination of funny and appropriate for the initial instinct that we all had about the script, and what's the tone of the script overall? Because Marlon can go pretty far out there, you know what I mean?
Hmm.
And so you use all these different criteria to kind of put what you feel is best in your first cut. Now, having said that, you could cut a scene, and it could be kind of like adhering to the script as close as imaginable, but still end up being like a 15-minute scene, whereas it was 4 pages scripted. So because of, just trying to, make everything, that was shot work. My point here is being, it's really important for the editor to show the director everything he shot.
Hmm.
And the stuff that you might think is not going to end up in the final film. You can't go in and start making line cuts in your first cut, because ultimately the director is going to ask, where is that? What happened to that shot? What happened to that joke?
And let's
Um,
say if you go in, you sit with your director, you have scene one, and it was improvised. You had cut it on your own, and you'd made great choices. The director loves the scene. Do you still go back in, even with the approval at that point of the director, and say, here are some of the other alternate takes that were flagged? Do you go there at that stage or ever, or is that at that point, if you've made a decision and the director's on board with it, and you have, two, three other potential takes that you were, considering but that didn't make the cut, would you ever go back in and actually review those with the director?
Ultimately, we end up looking at almost all the material.
Okay, you do together, yeah.
Yeah, that's just the process.
Yeah.
It's certainly the process Mike and I have sort of, done over the last three pictures. Um, he wants to see everything he shot. Most of the time, a lot of times we'll see something and we'll see that it's just not, working, and we'll fast forward through it. But ultimately, we end up looking at almost everything in some form or another. Now, we use this tool that the Avid has called Script Sync, which is basically you input the script into the Avid, and then the assistant inputs, basically transcribes all the improv and things like that, marks it up, and you can pretty much find any line that was read in the movie through text-based search or bin search, things like that. I also mark up the actual takes with markers and comments so I can find, readings of jokes and different variations of jokes and things like that as quickly as possible. So, that's kind of like a process we've developed over the last, few films, because otherwise we would never be able to find the material. But again, to answer your question is, I'll show a version and maybe it won't have a part of a joke that I didn't think was right, but I'll still have cut that part and I'll keep it in a bin as an alternate version. So a lot of times, we might look at something and he might think it's great. And, he might say, but what about that thing that he did with this? And I'll go, oh yeah, I cut that. Here's the alternate version. I'll show it to him and he'll say, yeah, I see why you didn't put that in.
Mm-hmm.
Or let's figure out a way to make that work.
Yeah. So
You know what I'm
at the end of
saying?
the day, one way or another, basically it all gets watched, minus anything that's just obviously not going to work, and maybe you skip through it. But basically everything's going to have to get watched, even if your first take is, essentially your first pass at it is a home run. I mean, you still, I guess at a certain point, you're still going in and fine tuning and tweaking, and then you change one thing, and that probably opens up a can of worms where, okay, if we change this one shot or this one joke, then that has a ripple effect and so forth, I would imagine.
Yeah.
So it very
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah. And I'm curious as to, just to shift gears for a second, because I could honestly talk about that, just process stuff with you, literally all day. I find it fascinating. But I
Yes.
do want to get to just some, I guess maybe as you reflect back on some of the films that you've worked on and looking at your career as a whole, just lessons learned that may apply to filmmakers, editors, anyone that's trying to make their way in the business, things that maybe you wish you would know, you knew when you were 19 or 22 and you were starting out. These could be, stylistic things, creative things, business, personal, whatever it may be. But is there anything, that you could distill down from your career and share with the up and comers that might be helpful for them, just as some words of wisdom?
Well, I think that the most important lesson that I've learned, in my career has been put your ego aside. I think as creative people, especially the younger we are, because this was the case when I was young, we, sort of put a stake in the ground, and we want to stand by it. And I mean, I think that I've become so much more flexible and open to the myriad of ideas that are going to come up in a cutting room. And yes, of course, I have my feelings, my strong feelings about what's good editorially, what's elegant editorially, stylistically, things like that. But ultimately, we're there at the service of the director and, by extension, the producers and obviously the studio, the financial interests. And we work for them. So at a certain point in time, unless you, again, have some sort of like Swiss bank account or benefactor and are going to quit,
Mm-hmm.
you know, you work for them.
Yeah.
And I think that it's really important to kind of just really be respectful of their process and what they're going through and what they need, what they're dealing with, because they're dealing with a whole set of parameters that editors never have to deal with.
Yep.
And stars and studios and things like that. So it's sort of like, put your ego aside, really kind of like get off your high horse, Larry, and do your best to bring the director's vision to fruition. And so, ever since I've adopted that sort of like mindset or attitude, whatever you want to call it, I find the creative process to be much more sort of liberating and freeing. And I try things with much more sort of, like I say, open-mindedness, and it's kind of made it more fun in a way,
Yeah, it does. It's funny because I've spoken about this book many times on the podcast, but for me, one of the most influential books I've read as far as filmmaking or creativity is concerned is The Artist's Way. And I'm not sure if you've read it, but the whole kind of premise...
Julia Cameron?
Julia Cameron. Yeah, exactly. And
yeah.
To me, the big takeaway was in a nutshell, exactly what you just said. It was, put a little differently, but basically have fun, let yourself have fun with it, and don't always take things so seriously. It doesn't mean you can't be a professional, you can't have work ethic and all the rest of it, but there has to sort of be a fun in it. And I think when your ego gets in the way, from my experience at least, then that kind of doesn't make it fun anymore. And I think a lot of us got into this line of work because we want to, pretend and make movies and enjoy. So why not, exercise that fun, creative muscle? And it's definitely something I think I'm probably still learning, but I wish I had a more clear picture of exactly what you just described years ago as well, when I was really first starting. But
yeah,
I mean,
because exactly what you're saying. I mean, it's like I love movies. Movies are, like you say, fun to me, and I used to say that to my crew. It's like if we're not having fun, we should be doing something else. I mean, obviously it's hard work and there are going to be difficult moments, but it's sort of like, it's that mindset where you can really get yourself into the zone and you can really be creative, even if, it's not your idea, so to speak. I mean, like you were just talking about, the first cut, and I remember stories about how, there were editors who said, oh, they didn't change any of my cuts. It's like, that's probably not a really good sign. I mean, writing is rewriting and editing is re-editing, and it's a constant, honing process. It's a collaborative effort to make something that, is going to resonate with people. So, I think that you kind of keep that in mind when you're working, even if you're on your own, you should kind of like get feedback, because none of us live in a vacuum.
And so on that note, that's actually something I meant to ask you about earlier and kind of slipped by me. But as far as feedback is concerned, we talked a little bit about working with the director, and obviously that's a very specific relationship. But as far as things like test screenings or doing any sort of focus groups or anything like that, if on the level that you're working at, I'm assuming most of your films, and correct me if I'm wrong, but most of them probably go through several rounds of test screenings, or is it just different for every movie? Okay, great. And
no, it is different for every movie, but absolutely. I mean, pretty much every movie I've ever worked on We've done previews, test screenings from small friends and family, maybe 25 people or 50 people to, three or 400 people in a theater.
And for anyone that is listening that hasn't been to one of these screenings, typically the ones that I've been to, friends of mine who have made larger scale films and so forth, and I've been to quite a few of these, and there's almost always a questionnaire, and it will ask, what are your favorite parts of the movie, which characters do you like, which do you not like, and so forth. When you receive that feedback, I imagine if you show the film to 100 people, there may be certain commonalities, but there's probably going to be a lot of feedback that doesn't overlap. How do you deal with that sort of feedback where someone has maybe a really strong point of view on something that they really didn't like in the movie, but it's only one person saying it and nobody else said it? Do you look for volume, or how do you process that?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. That's what I look for. I look for consensus. I look for what most people are responding to. You're always going to get your outlier. Unfortunately, those are the things that the studio seems to latch onto and think that we need to fix because one person said it, and it was it's one of these really obvious notes that, or not obvious notes that, like, well, he was wearing a blue shirt in the first scene, and then in the last scene he was wearing a gray shirt or something, and it's like, if that's what they're focusing on, we've got bigger problems to solve. You know what I mean? But no, I mean, so you kind of, again, your first preview screening, your mind is probably going to be bent and stuff like that. But after you've done, 30 or 40 of them, they're kind of the same. You know what I mean? It's like you get the notes that there is consensus on. This scene or this part of the movie is where it slows down or where it drags. And, these are the scenes, the top 5 scenes that we thought were funny, and these are the bottom 5 scenes that we thought were not funny. So you get some sort of consensus, and you sort of work with that. I mean, that's what I always try to do. Mm-hmm. Although, by that point, the decision-making process is really with the producers, the director, and the studio. And, you kind of, I've seen directors and producers and just sort of ignore those, or not those, but ignore some sort of big notes, big sort of problematic areas that the audience, had a strong response to.
Interesting.
And I think it's hurt the movie. I think that we make movies, like I say, for people. But at the end of the day, it's their call, and they've got to do what they think is best, and maybe they have something in mind that we don't understand or aren't aware of.
And do you find that audiences, having done test screenings, I'm sure going back many, many years, you talked about being in a screening, although I'm sure that wasn't a test screening for Back to the Future, but you've been in, versions of test screenings, I'm sure, for decades. And do you think that audiences are any different now than, let's say, 20, 30 years ago in terms of just their I don't know what you'd call it, their film IQ, or their their
their film vocabulary.
There you go. I mean, just being able to look at something and, like the obvious example, it might be needing less of like a first act or something like that. Like, I often hear that from filmmakers, especially when I write scripts. Sometimes people will give me the note that, you don't need as much in the first act. Yeah. You can trim back. Do you find that there are any of those sort of just universal qualities that you've noticed that have that differ from earlier? Do you find audiences are getting more sophisticated just because of the amount of content that's out there now?
Absolutely. I really do see that. Now, you have to take into consideration is we used to screen previews out of town more often. They used to take them back to Chicago or Denver. Denver was a big screening place back in the day. We seem to do a lot more previews locally over the last, 5-10 years. And, without sounding cynical, everybody in LA is a filmmaker. You know what I
It's
mean?
true.
And you have a lot of people who have a fairly sophisticated understanding of the filmmaking process, the story process, the writing process. So sometimes you will get those kinds of notes. I don't know what to say. Sometimes they can be helpful, and sometimes they're obnoxious.
Hmm.
It's really kind of like I think how it's presented quite often. But overall, I think absolutely people are much more sophisticated about the content creation process in general. I mean, let's face it, everyone has a copy of, or not everyone, but a lot of people have a copy of Final Cut Pro on their computer.
Hmm.
And a lot of people have dabbled in editing, even if it was just Windows Movie Maker. So a lot of people have a much, sort of broader understanding of what editing, quote unquote, is. Maybe not professional level editing, but, splicing two clips together. So from that level to a much more sophisticated level, people have a much greater vocabulary, and they can communicate about things, more clearly, and it's pretty amazing. I mean, we're like we talked about earlier, we're going through this time where and this is something that has excited me since the beginning of digital editing and digital cinematography. We're going through a time where anybody who has a story to tell can really tell it. And I think that's a really good thing.
Yep.
I think that that's, this is something that the world can really use, where people who have, been underrepresented in some way, shape or form, and sort of locked out of the system, can go and make a film and see what the audience has to say about it, and so on and so forth.
That's amazing. And as far as filmmakers who want to maybe educate themselves and be able to tell a story that connects with audiences in 2019 and through the lens of an audience member in 2019, if you were going to recommend for a filmmaker or an up and coming editor, the top 10 movies that they could watch and study to be a great editor in 2019, would most of those references now have to be more current films just because the style and the pace and all that has changed so much? Or would it be a pretty healthy mix going back to some of the classics as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to mix it up. I mean, I love a lot of the things that are being done currently. A lot of things that are being done editorially today have a very close connection, if not direct connection, to visual effects. So the job is changing in a lot of respects. We did a comedy that has almost 1,000 visual effects in it just
Wow.
now.
And are those obvious effects, or those things like removing a logo or that sort of thing? Are they full
Well,
blown?
it's everything. The story is called Sextuplets, and Marlon Wayans plays 7 parts.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay.
so, so it's a lot of digital compositing, a lot of blue screen, motion control. There's a CGI character that I won't reveal the identity of until it comes out, because I'm probably not allowed to.
Hmm.
But it's a pretty amazing CGI character that was created by Image Engine. That they create a lot of the. They did a lot of work on, for example, Spider-Man: Far From Home. So just in terms of that aspect of the craft, it's changing a lot, and visual effects and editorial are having to work and communicate much more frequently. However, storytelling is storytelling. So, even with all the whiz bang effects and great stuff we can do now, it's really critical to learn the storytelling craft. So, and you can do that by looking at, the classics, the great movies, Citizen Kane and Godfather and Bonnie and Clyde and The Verdict.
Hmm.
I mean, those films are, for me at least, those were like incredibly engrossing stories that when they finished, I was like, oh, I would have loved to have had this thing go on for another hour or so.
Exactly.
And and that's what we're trying to do as filmmakers, right? We're really trying to capture the audience's imagination. So
So it's almost
it's
referencing the older films from the storytelling perspective and some of the newer ones, maybe from that as well, but also from the technical workflow post production point of view of this is now how you're actually going to physically construct the film, but the roots and the DNA. I mean, there's so many films, including many of the films that you've worked on, that I think that are amazing case studies just in how to tell a great story, how to engage an audience.
yeah, I mean, it's really sort of like splitting along theatrical and streaming lines. I mean, a lot of great stories are being told in the streaming platform and in the multi-episode series platform or venue. The theater seems to be more and more reserved for these big tentpole spectacular visual effects movies and things like that. These sort of epic comic book movies.
Hmm. Do you think that will
And
continue? I'm sorry to interrupt you again, but
no,
that was something else I was meaning to ask you because I think about that often, and I wouldn't say I'm a diehard fan of those sort of movies, but I definitely love that they exist and I enjoy them, and I'm just a movie lover in general, so I like any movie. But I do, if I'm being honest, I am nostalgic for the days when something like Shawshank Redemption or something would have been. I don't think those
yeah,
sort of movies would ever be in a theater today, and that kind of makes me a little bit sad in a way. But I wonder if that will. Do you think that we're where we are now is just going to continue on this trajectory? If you had to speculate, or do you think we'll hit a point where we may see some more of those, almost like we did maybe in the '90s, like some more of those sort of larger independent type movies that maybe they're studio, maybe not, but those more original, less franchisey sort of movies hitting the theaters. Do you think that's just a lost art theatrically at this point, or maybe will we
I
see that return?
yeah, I mean, I don't have a crystal ball, but I will tell you that the economics of it seem to uh, you know tell a story that we will see more and more of these spectacular sort of commercial properties being released in the theaters, and pretty much all of these sort of independent kind of smaller films will be sort of available via streaming.
Hmm.
I mean, if you think about it, it really comes down to what it costs to market a movie these days. A film like the average film cost, I don't know, something like $10 or $20 million just to sort of get any kind of visibility.
Yeah.
So I don't see how it can be any other way. And but we're fortunate that companies like Netflix and Amazon are really embracing the part of the market that seems to have gone away.
Yeah,
Or
it's
gone
true.
away theatrically to a great extent. So I do see theatrical films going more the way of sort of like Broadway plays and things like that. Where you have these big spectacles like Cats and things
Yeah,
like
yeah,
that.
yeah. Well, I think
With
you're
the editing.
right. I've heard people describe Netflix as sort of the new art house theater, or iTunes as like that's where you go now, because a lot of cities, I mean, here in LA we're lucky because there's still quite a few, but a lot of cities, like I said, I grew up in Toronto, and there were all
Mhm.
these cool art house theaters, and virtually every single one of them is gone now, and you can't really see those movies. There's the Tiff Bell Lightbox from the Toronto Film Festival; they have a nice theater, but other than
Mhm.
that, it's really really limited. So I think you're right, for better for worse. But again, I had to sort of get your 2 cents on it, just having the perspective that you do, working where you do, and having seen so much change. I think that the time that you came into the business is amazing in the sense that you probably have been able to witness so much change in so many different ways, more so than any other couple 2-3 decade period maybe in film.
Hmm.
80s to now, it's pretty amazing what's happened.
Yeah.
So before we wrap up, can you tell me a little bit about just some of the educational stuff that you do? Because I always find this interesting. I'm someone that very much believes in giving back whatever little bit that I learn over the course of my career. I'm always trying to share that back, whether it's through a blog or have experts like yourself on the podcast, and just help educate other filmmakers. And I know that's something that's important to you as well. So can you talk a little bit about that and then explain sort of how that has manifested in your career, your life?
Yeah, no, I mean, I've always been, excited about sharing my excitement for making films. I think that editing is kind of like a fine combination of, it's kind of like a triangle of technical, creative, and how do I say, diplomatic,
Hmm.
interpersonal sort of skills that you've got to master. And, like I said earlier, when I got in, it was a closed system. And, I never liked that about, the fact that I was able to get in, that other people sort of didn't have those opportunities. So, from very early on, a combination of that and my passion for filmmaking and digital technology and what have you, I just like to share that knowledge. And, when the Avid first came out, I sort of developed a course over at UCLA Extension, introducing people into what was happening in terms of digital editing and the Avid Media Composer. And then I was asked to kind of help out, became an adjunct professor at the AFI, in the first few years of their editing track. And then I kind of like got, sort of submerged in my editing career myself. But I developed this website back in the day when Final Cut came out called 2pop.com. And really what that was just sort of a community of fellow filmmakers and editors, post-production professionals that wanted to learn all about this new technology. Because again, the idea of the democratization of the medium just seems like it's just something that resonates with me. And, as I continued to work, I started working, obviously editing more, and you kind of like the assisting and the workflow part kind of goes by the wayside to a certain extent because you're really, focusing on the creative aspects of editing. And I was working with my assistant, Richard Sanchez, on a couple of films back, and I was watching his workflow and I was noticing some of the things that he was doing. And what I noticed was that he really took a lot of the film sort of models that we used to practice, and he's just really transferred them into the digital age. We used to keep a paper code book where we had to keep track of all the film so we can go back and cut negative and things like that. And he created something called, we call the digital code book, which is really like this supercharged FileMaker Pro database, which basically catalogs and you can import and export all of the critical metadata that you need to track on a film. And like I said, with 200 hours of dailies on this last film and 1,000 visual effects, you can imagine how huge an amount of material that is. And we just started talking about his workflow, and I was so impressed with how well he was handling the film. And when I needed things, he was able to find it so quickly that, we started to talk about how do people learn this stuff these days? I really can't believe they teach this in film school. And, we really talked to a lot of people and, who had been through film school and said, and they don't get that kind of education. They don't get that nuts and bolts training of what it's like to work in a cutting room, a real high-end professional feature film or television cutting room. So we decided to make a course and basically teach people the process from before they even, start a show to final delivery of materials to the studio. And, it's just a deep drill down. We weren't sure if anybody was going to be interested in it at first. And we put up a little test balloon in some Facebook groups. And in like 48 hours, we got over 300 responses.
Wow.
So, yeah, it kind of confirmed that there's so many people out there really hungry for this knowledge.
Yes.
And it's been great. We've had over 400 students go through the program in like under 2 years.
That's amazing. And is it open enrollment anytime if someone wants to go, they can access, or is it limited to just certain periods?
Well, enrollment, we kind of limit to, we do it basically on a quarterly basis. Mm-hmm. What we're trying to do is just, not have so many people that we need to support, that we can't do it. So we kind of just sort of manage it that way, because both Richard and I are we're working editors, and we want to be able to provide the best, support we can. And it's just me and him at this point. We're in the process of developing a few more classes. We'd like to sort of provide something for the independent filmmakers out there. Our course it's taught on the Avid. I mean, the model can be applied to anything, but it's specific to the Avid. We're thinking about doing some stuff Premiere and then just some more in-depth stuff on the Avid and maybe visual effects and things like that. And maybe, something about post-production for non-editors. There seems to be a real hunger for knowledge out there. And, we've had fun doing this. And I don't know how much longer I can keep editing.
Well, it sounds amazing. And it definitely sounds like nothing that I've seen or heard of. Certainly far more in-depth than what you might get from a film school training in post-production. Not that I went to film school, but from what I've been told. But also the angle that you're coming at from. Most people who are in your position, who have worked on the type of films that you have and have built the sort of career that you have not actually taken the time to do what you've done and create something educational. And there's always that gap, I think, between what people teach you that actually don't work in the industry and then the experience that you get once you're in the industry, and bridging that gap can be a huge challenge. So it sounds like you've definitely done a lot to help make that bridge happen. And it sounds like an amazing course. If people want to find it, how can they find it? And also, how can they find some of your other stuff online? If there's anything else you want to share, website or anything else that you'd like to leave with the listeners?
Yeah, sure. I mean, they can just, do a Google search on the name of our company, which is Master the Workflow. They can go to mastertheworkflow.com. We have a sort of an aspiring Instagram account, and we have, sort of a very limited YouTube presence right now. But that's because we've both been working on fairly intense projects. But we plan on upping our ante a little bit there, as much as we can. Or just shoot us an email at info at mastertheworkflow.com. We're really accessible. Like I said, we've had 400 people go through the program in over 35 countries around the world. We enrolled a student last session in Estonia, of all places, and
wow.
I didn't even know they make films in Estonia, so wow, I was very impressed.
So cool. It's amazing how far-reaching it can be. And by the way, I'm going to include all these links in the show notes as well. But cool. I'll let you continue.
Yeah, and again, no, I mean, we open, usually, we like to try to do it 4 times a year, but like I said, we're working editors, so, we try to, we have our own, obligations. But what you said was something, one of the reasons why we really wanted to do this ourselves And what we believe is unique about what we're teaching is that, we're filmmakers who have been doing it. I've been doing it going on, like 30 plus years. Richard's been doing it 15 years. We've been in the trenches. We like to believe we can help people, newcomers and those who have been working in the business themselves for a while. We can help them solve different, problems, because that's pretty much a big part of the editorial craft is being a problem solver, and so on. So, I mean, yeah, just reach out to us. We also have a program for those who are in the Motion Picture Editors Guild nationwide. We've recently been approved. We've recently been made an approved training vendor for contract services, which is, if you're in the union, you'll know what that is, and you can get reimbursed for like 2/3 of the course. So that's kind of a cool thing, and you can find out more about that on our website.
That's amazing. That's incredible. That I didn't realize the affiliation as well with the guild. So that's incredible. But yeah.
We're working with we're working a little bit with the guild, but we have a really, really nice relationship with the American Cinema Editors, and we've been at their last couple of Edit Fests here in LA, and I did Edit Fest London last year, and we actually try to provide scholarships. We provided 10 scholarships to ACE interns and fellowship recipients this year. So, and we'll be at Edit Fest this year in August. So, yeah, we have a really nice relationship with ACE. We've got a good relationship with Avid, and yeah, we're trying to reach out there.
That's incredible. Well, thank you so much for not only being on the show, but all that you're doing to give back to other filmmakers and to run that course. And as someone who juggles lots of different things at all times, I know, and I can only imagine for you, it's there's a lot of time that goes into everything. So it's definitely recognized, it's valued, and you're helping a lot of filmmakers. I'm sure you know that, but I certainly would recommend that if any filmmakers listening to this, that's the sort of thing that you're going to want to learn from somebody that didn't go to film school and learned everything by trial and error. I would have much rather taken a course like yours, and I likely still will, because I'm sure there's still so much that I can learn from it. But as I said before, I'm going to leave all the links in the show notes for the episode to Master the Workflow, to the actual site, social media, anywhere else that you can find Master the Workflow. That'll all be here in the show notes for this episode. And unless there's anything else you'd like to add, I kept you half an hour longer than I said, so I'll let you go pretty much now. But again, I can't thank you enough for making the time to come on the show and share all your words of wisdom, and hopefully we'll get a chance to do it again sometime.